In the early hours of January 3, 2026, the United States carried out a large-scale military operation inside Venezuela that resulted in the detention of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. According to U.S. defense officials, the operation began shortly after 2 a.m. local time. More than 150 American military aircraft entered Venezuelan airspace. Multiple explosions were reported across Caracas, accompanied by widespread power outages as key infrastructure systems were disabled. U.S. officials later confirmed that the operation targeted air defense systems, communications networks, and electrical facilities. President Donald Trump stated that the strikes demonstrated what he described as America's expertise in disabling critical infrastructure. Within approximately 30 minutes, U.S. Special Operations Forces reached Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex located in the capital. There, they detained President Maduro and his wife inside what U.S. sources described as a fortified compound. By dawn, Maduro was transferred to the USS Iwo Jima and transported toward the United States. Later that day, U.S. authorities announced that Maduro would be taken to New York to face charges related to narcotics trafficking and terrorism. The U.S. Department of Justice stated that these charges stem from long-running investigations into alleged links between senior Venezuelan officials and international drug networks. Speaking from Mar-a-Lago, President Trump described the operation as one of the most effective displays of American military capability in history. He further announced that the United States would oversee governance in Venezuela until further notice, citing concerns about security and stability. The operation marked the first time in modern history that the United States has detained a sitting Latin American head of state through direct military action. Diplomatic context. What was not publicly addressed in the initial U.S. announcement was the diplomatic activity taking place in Caracas in the hours preceding the operation. According to Venezuelan and Chinese sources, President Maduro had met earlier that same day with Chu Xiaoliang, China's special envoy for Latin American affairs. The meeting reportedly focused on energy cooperation, oil exports, and bilateral development initiatives. Venezuelan officials described the discussions as part of a broader effort to strengthen what both countries refer to as a multipolar development framework. Analysts note that the timing of the U.S. operation, occurring shortly after that meeting, has drawn attention internationally. While U.S. officials have denied any connection between the diplomatic engagement and the military action, several foreign policy experts argue that the sequence of events carries broader geopolitical implications. International reactions from outside the United States were swift. China's foreign ministry issued a statement calling the operation deeply shocking and described it as a violation of international law, the United Nations Charter, and the principle of national sovereignty. Beijing demanded the immediate release of President Maduro and his wife. Notably, however, China did not announce retaliatory measures or military responses. Instead, Chinese officials emphasized diplomatic channels and legal frameworks, signaling a cautious but deliberate response. Other nations in the global south expressed concern over the precedent set by the operation, warning that it could further erode established norms governing state sovereignty and the use of force. Why Venezuela matters. Beyond politics and leadership, Venezuela holds strategic significance due to its natural resources. According to OPEC's 2025 Annual Statistical Bulletin, Venezuela possesses approximately 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest total in the world. This places it ahead of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Canada. Nearly 18% of the planet's known oil reserves are located within Venezuelan territory, primarily concentrated in the Orinoco Belt, a vast geological formation stretching more than 600 kilometers across the country's interior. Data from the U.S. Geological Survey indicates that total oil deposits in the Orinoco region could reach as high as 1.4 trillion barrels, with recoverable reserves estimated at nearly 400 billion barrels under current technological and economic conditions. However, Venezuela's crude oil differs significantly from the lighter crude produced in many other regions. Venezuelan oil is classified as heavy and sulfur-rich, requiring specialized extraction methods and advanced refining infrastructure. Many of the world's refineries capable of processing this type of crude are located along the U.S. Gulf Coast, built decades ago to handle heavy oil imports from Venezuela. This technical reality has long shaped energy relationships between Venezuela and major consuming nations, including the United States. Looking ahead, The events of January 3rd have raised fundamental questions about international law, energy security, and great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. To understand the broader consequences of the operation and why it may extend far beyond Venezuela, it is necessary to examine China's long-term economic and strategic involvement in the country. Following the U.S. operation in Venezuela, China's response stood out for what it did not include. Beijing did not announce economic sanctions, it did not withdraw its ambassador, nor did it sever diplomatic relations with Washington or Caracas. Instead, Chinese officials emphasized continuity. The Foreign Ministry stated that China intended to maintain communication and cooperation with whoever ultimately governs Venezuela, and that existing commercial commitments, including oil-related agreements, would remain unchanged. Analysts interpret this approach as a deliberate effort to insulate Chinese economic interests from political outcomes. According to assessments by the Economist Intelligence Unit, China's long-term strategy in Venezuela has focused less on political alignment and more on infrastructure, finance, and supply chain control. Over the past 2 decades, Chinese state-owned enterprises and financial institutions have invested heavily in Venezuelan energy projects, transportation infrastructure, telecommunications networks, and port facilities. These assets remain operational regardless of leadership changes. Joint ventures between Chinese firms and Venezuela's state oil company continue to function. Loan agreements and repayment obligations remain legally binding. Commercial relationships with local businesses and military-linked entities persist. In contrast, the United States now faces the immediate challenge of managing the political and economic consequences of the operation. While President Maduro has been removed, Venezuela's institutional structure remains largely intact. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez assumed interim presidential authority under constitutional succession rules. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez continues to command the armed forces. The civil service, security apparatus, and state-owned enterprises remain in place. President Trump stated that the United States would oversee governance in Venezuela for an unspecified period. However, U.S. officials have not outlined a detailed administrative framework or timeline. Economic indicators highlight the scale of the challenge. Venezuela's economy has contracted by an estimated 75% over the past decade. Hyperinflation has severely weakened the national currency. Basic services, including electricity, water supply, and healthcare, remain unreliable. According to United Nations data, more than 6 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2015. Several analysts note that post-conflict stabilization and long-term governance typically require substantial financial and political commitments. Occupation and reconstruction costs historically exceed the expense of initial military operations. Regional and global international reaction to the operation extended beyond geopolitical rivals of the United States. Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, issued one of the strongest responses. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva described the operation as an unacceptable escalation and warned that it could undermine multilateralism and regional stability. He referenced Latin America's history of foreign intervention during the Cold War, a period marked by U.S.-backed authoritarian regimes. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum stated that the strikes violated the United Nations Charter and called for an immediate end to military actions. Speaking on January 5th, she remarked that historical experience in Latin America shows that external intervention has not resulted in democratic outcomes. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro characterized the operation as an act of aggression against Venezuelan sovereignty and, by extension, regional sovereignty. Chile's outgoing president, Gabriel Boric, described it as a breach of a fundamental principle of international law. These responses are notable because several of the governments involved have previously criticized Maduro's leadership and declined to recognize the legitimacy of Venezuela's disputed 2024 election. Despite those differences, they jointly opposed the use of unilateral military force. On January 4th, Brazil, Spain, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay released a joint statement expressing profound concern and rejecting the unilateral military action carried out in Venezuelan territory. The statement described Latin America as a zone of peace and warned against any attempt at foreign governmental control, administration, or appropriation of strategic or natural resources. United Nations proceedings. The United Nations Security Council convened on January 5th at the request of China, Colombia, and Russia. Venezuela's representative argued that the operation placed not only national sovereignty at risk, but also the credibility of international law and the authority of the United Nations itself. The representative stated that allowing a single state to act simultaneously as judge, enforcer, and administrator would undermine the global legal framework. Economist Jeffrey Sachs, who briefed the council, framed the issue as one of precedent rather than Venezuelan governance. He stated that the central question was whether any member state has the right, through force or economic coercion, to determine another nation's political future or exercise control over its internal affairs. No resolution authorizing the operation was presented, and divisions among permanent members prevented collective action. Broader financial and strategic context. Several analysts argue that the Venezuela operation has broader implications for the international financial system. China has spent years promoting alternative economic frameworks through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These efforts aim to reduce reliance on dollar-dominated financial institutions. Recent data suggests that diversification is accelerating. According to the International Monetary Fund, the US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined to approximately 58%, its lowest level in over 2 decades. Central banks collectively added more than 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, continuing a multi-year trend. Several major economies have expanded non-dollar trade arrangements. China and Russia now conduct most bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. Brazil and China have established direct settlement mechanisms between their currencies. India has purchased Russian oil using rupees. Saudi Arabia has accepted yuan payments for certain oil transactions, a significant shift given its historical role in the dollar-based energy system. With Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and other producers participating in BRICS-related frameworks, member states now account for an estimated 40% of global oil production. Analysts note that if a larger share of energy trade moves away from dollar pricing, demand for dollar-denominated assets could weaken over time. In this context, the Venezuela operation has reinforced concerns among resource-rich nations about political risk and financial exposure. Several observers argue that it may encourage further diversification away from US-controlled financial channels rather than deter it. Military assessment. From a purely operational perspective, US defense officials described the mission as successful. American forces reportedly neutralized Venezuelan air defense systems, including long- and medium-range missile batteries, short-range systems, and anti-aircraft artillery. Ground forces numbering approximately 93,000 were reportedly rendered non-operational during the initial phase. The extraction of President Maduro was completed in under 30 minutes, with no US casualties reported in official statements. However, military analysts caution that tactical effectiveness does not necessarily translate into strategic success. US defense officials have acknowledged that several American service members were injured during the operation. Despite those injuries, military analysts widely described the mission as tactically successful. Venezuelan air defenses were suppressed, command and control systems disrupted, and the extraction of President Maduro was completed in a short operational window. However, multiple analysts emphasize that operational effectiveness does not necessarily equate to strategic success. The operation demonstrated the United States' capacity to conduct rapid, high-intensity military actions and to detain foreign leaders abroad. At the same time, it has raised significant questions regarding precedent, international law, and long-term geopolitical consequences. Several international legal scholars have warned that the action may establish a new model of state behavior. Under this precedent, a powerful nation could indict a foreign leader under domestic law, deploy military forces under the justification of law enforcement or counter-narcotics operations, and then use direct force to bring that leader to trial. Legal experts argue that such a framework challenges long-standing norms governing sovereignty, non-intervention, and the use of force. China has not explicitly framed the issue in these terms. Instead, Beijing has continued to emphasize stability, continuity of commercial relations, and non-interference. Analysts suggest this approach allows China to position itself as a predictable partner while avoiding direct confrontation. From China's perspective, influence is maintained not through control of governments, but through infrastructure, financing, logistics, and trade networks. Chinese policy banks, state-owned enterprises, and energy firms have continued operations in Venezuela throughout periods of sanctions and political instability. Energy and economic realities. President Trump stated in interviews that part of the motivation for the operation was Venezuela's past nationalization of American-owned oil assets during 2006 and 2007. He asserted that Venezuela should be required to compensate U.S. companies for what he described as confiscated infrastructure, and indicated that American firms could play a role in rebuilding the country's oil sector. The scale of that task is substantial. Venezuela's oil production peaked in the late 1990s at approximately 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2025, output had fallen to roughly 960,000 barrels per day. Industry assessments attribute the decline to underinvestment, mismanagement, corruption, skilled labor migration, and the cumulative impact of international sanctions. Energy analysts estimate that restoring production to former levels would require approximately $180 billion in investment over the next 15 years. Maintaining current production levels alone would require an estimated $50 billion in capital. Refineries and extraction facilities are aging. Equipment shortages persist. Skilled technical personnel remain scarce. Major American oil companies have not publicly committed to large-scale reinvestment. Analysts note that firms remain cautious due to past nationalizations, political instability, and uncertainty over future policy direction. Long-term capital investment typically requires guarantees that are difficult to secure in transitional political environments. By contrast, Chinese companies have already developed operational familiarity within Venezuela. They have maintained joint ventures, adapted to sanctions-related constraints, and invested incrementally over long time horizons. Several analysts suggest that regardless of political leadership, Venezuela's oil sector is likely to remain reliant on Chinese expertise and financing. Governance and legal challenges. As of this report, Nicolás Maduro is being held in federal detention in New York, facing charges that could result in life imprisonment. His wife remains in custody. Inside Venezuela, the governmental apparatus remains largely intact. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has assumed executive authority. The military command structure continues under Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. Intelligence agencies and state institutions remain operational. International legal experts have issued critical assessments of the operation's legality. Jeffrey Robertson, a prominent human rights lawyer, stated that the action appears inconsistent with Article 2 of the United Nations Charter and could constitute a crime of aggression under international law. Professor Alvaro Dominguez Rodriguez of Kingston University stated that there was no publicly available evidence supporting claims of self-defense or authorization by the UN Security Council, conditions typically required to justify the use of force. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expressed concern through his spokesperson, stating that established rules of international law had not been respected, and warning of potential destabilizing effects for the region. Broader systemic impact observers note that enforcement of international law depends on collective mechanisms. When actions are taken by states that dominate those mechanisms, accountability becomes complex. This dynamic has fueled interest among many countries in alternative financial and institutional arrangements. In recent years, China and its partners have expanded systems designed to reduce reliance on US-dominated financial infrastructure. These include cross-border payment platforms, regional development banks, and local currency trade settlements. The Bridge digital currency platform, involving China, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates, allows cross-border settlements without routing transactions through US-controlled systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system now connects thousands of banks across more than 180 countries. Economists note that these developments have accelerated as countries seek to reduce exposure to political risk associated with dollar-based systems. Long-term outlook military institutions are expected to study the technical execution of the operation for years. Diplomatic institutions are likely to analyze the regional response and alliance dynamics. Economists are expected to track shifts in trade settlement, reserve composition, and capital flows. Several analysts argue that the Venezuela operation may ultimately be remembered less for its military execution and more for its role in accelerating systemic change. Energy markets, currency systems, and geopolitical alignments are already evolving. Trust between states, once lost, is difficult to restore. Legitimacy, once questioned, is challenging to rebuild. As global trade patterns adjust and alternative financial systems expand, governments around the world are reassessing exposure to political and economic risk. In that reassessment, many analysts conclude that the consequences of the Venezuela operation will extend far beyond the country itself, shaping global power dynamics well into the coming decades.